The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam by Dr. Muhammad Iqbal. Lecture 5, The Spirit of Muslim Culture, Part 2. But we must not forget that the words proximity, contact, and mutual separation, which apply to material bodies, do not apply to God. Divine life is in touch with the whole universe on the analogy of the soul's contact with the body. The soul is neither inside nor outside the body, neither proximate to nor separate from it. Yet its contact with every atom of the body is real, and it is impossible to conceive this contact except by positioning some kind of space between two, which befits the subtleness of the soul. The existence of the space in relation to the life of God, therefore, cannot be denied. Only we should carefully define the kind of space which may be predicated of the absoluteness of God. Now, there are three kinds of space: the space of material bodies, the space of immaterial beings, and the space of God. The space of material bodies is further divided into three kinds. First, the space of gross bodies, of which we predicate roominess. In this space, movement takes place. It takes time. Bodies occupy their respective places and resist displacement. Secondly, the space of subtle bodies, for example, air and sound. In this space too, bodies resist each other and their movement is measurable in terms of time, which, however, appears to be different to the time of gross bodies. The air in a tube must be displaced before other air can enter into it, and the time of sound waves is practically nothing compared to the time of gross bodies. Thirdly, we have the space of light. The light of the sun instantly reaches the remotest limits of the earth. Thus, in the velocity of life and sound, time is reduced almost to zero. It is therefore clear that the space of light is different to the space of air and sound. There is, however, a more effective argument than this. The light of a candle spreads in all directions in a room without displacing the air in the room. And this shows that the space of light is more subtle than the space of air, which has no entry into the space of light. In view of the close proximity of these spaces, however, it is not possible to distinguish the one from the other, except by purely intellectual analysis and spiritual experience. Again, in the hot water, the two opposites, fire and water, which appear to interpenetrate each other, cannot, in view of their respective natures, exist in the same space. The fact cannot be explained except on the supposition that the spaces of the two substances, though closely proximate to each other, are nevertheless distinct. But while the element of distance is not entirely absent, there is no possibility of mutual resistance in the space of light. The light of a candle reaches up to a certain point only, and the lights of 100 candles intermingle in the same room without displacing one another. Having thus described the spaces of physical bodies possessing various degrees of subtleness, Iraqi proceeds briefly to describe the main varieties of space operated upon by the various classes of immaterial beings, for example, angels. The element of distance is not entirely absent from these spaces. For immaterial beings, while they can easily pass through stone walls, not altogether dispense with motion, which, according to Iraqi, is evidence of imperfection in spirituality. The highest point in the scale of spatial freedom is reached by the human soul, which, in its unique essence, is neither at rest nor in motion. Thus, passing through the infinite varieties of space, we can reach the divine space, which is absolutely free from all dimensions and constitutes the meeting point of all infinities. From this summary of Iraqi's view, you will see how a cultured Muslim Sufi intellectually interpreted his spiritual experience of time and space in an age which had no idea of the theories and concepts of modern mathematics and physics. Iraqi is really trying to reach the concept of space as a dynamic appearance. His mind seems to be vaguely struggling with the concept of space as an infinite continuum. Yet, he was unable to see the full implications of his thought, partly because he was not a mathematician and partly because of his natural prejudice in favor of the traditional Aristotelian idea of a fixed universe. Again, the interpretation of the superspatial here and super eternal now is the ultimate reality, suggests the modern notion of space-time which Professor Alexander, in his lecture on space-time and deity, regards as the matrix of all things. A keener insight into the nature of time would have led Iraqi to see that time is more fundamentally important of the two, and that it is not a mere metaphor to say, as Professor Alexander does say, that time is the mind of space. Iraqi conceives God's relation to the universe on the analogy of the relation of the human soul to the body. But instead of philosophically reaching this position through a criticism of the spatial and temporal aspects of experience, he simply postulates it on the basis of his spiritual experience. It is not sufficient merely to reduce space and time to a vanishing point instant. The philosophical path that leads to God as the omnipsyche of the universe lies through the discovery of living thought as the ultimate principle of space-time. Iraqi's mind, no doubt, moved in the right direction, but his Aristotelian prejudices, coupled with the lack of psychological analysis, blocked his progress. With his view that divine time is utterly devoid of change, a view obviously based on an inadequate analysis of conscious experience, it was not possible for him to discover the relation between divine time and serial time, and to reach through this discovery the essentially Islamic idea of continuous creation, which means a growing universe. Thus, all lines of Muslim thought converge on a dynamic conception of the universe. This view is further reinforced by Ibn Masakawi's theory of life as an evolutionary movement and Ibn Khaldun's view of history. History, or in the language of the Quran, the days of God, is the third source of human knowledge according to the Quran. It is one of the most essential teachings of the Quran that nations are collectively judged and suffer for their misdeeds here and now. In order to establish this proposition, the Quran constantly cites historical instances and urges upon the reader to reflect on the past and present experience of mankind. Of old did we send Moses with our signs and said to him, "Bring forth thy people from the darkness into the light and remind them of the days of God. Verily, in this are signs for every patient, grateful person." 14:5. And among those whom we have created are a people who guide others with truth and in accordance therewith act justly. But as for those who treat our signs as lies, we gradually wring them down by means of which they know not. And though I lengthen their days, verily, my stratagem is effectual. 7, 181 to 183. Already before your time have precedents been made. Traverse the earth then and see what hath been the end of those who falsify the signs of God. 3:137. If a wound hath befallen you, a wound like it hath already befallen others, we alternate the days of successes and reverses amongst peoples. 3:140. Every nation hath its fixed period. 7:34. The last verse is rather an instance of a more specific historical generalization, which, in its epigrammatic formulation, suggests the possibility of a scientific treatment of life of human societies regarded as organisms. It is therefore a gross error to think that the Quran has no germs of a historical doctrine. The truth is that the whole spirit of the Prolegomena of Ibn Khaldun appears to have been mainly due to the inspiration which the author must have received from the Quran. Even in his judgments of character, he is, in no small degree, indebted to the Quran. An instance in point is his long paragraph devoted to an estimate of the character of the Arabs as a people. The whole paragraph is a mere amplification of the following verses of the Quran. The Arabs of the desert are most stout in unbelief and dissimulation, and likelier it is that they should be unaware of the laws which God hath sent down to his apostle, and God is knowing wise. Of Arabs of the desert, there are some who reckon that they expend in the cause of God as tribute and wait for some change of fortune to befall you. A change for evil shall befall them. God is the hearer and knower. 9:97-98. However, the interest of the Quran in history, regarded as a source of human knowledge, extends further than mere indications of historical generalizations. It has given us one of the most fundamental principles of historical criticism. Since accuracy in recording facts which constitutes the material of history is an indispensable condition of history as a science, and an accurate knowledge of the facts ultimately depends on those who report them. The very first principle of historical criticism is that the reporter's personal character is an important factor in judging his testimony. The Quran says, "O believers, if any bad man comes to you with a report, clear it up at once." 49:6. It is the application of the principle embodied in this verse to the reporters of the Prophet's traditions, out of which were generally and gradually evolved the canons of historical criticisms. The growth of the historical sense in Islam is a fascinating subject. The Quranic appeal to experience, the necessity to ascertain the exact sayings of the Prophet, and the desire to furnish permanent sources of inspiration to posterity. All these forces contributed to produce such men as Ibn Ishaq, Tabari, and Al-Masudi. But history, as an art of firing the reader's imagination, is only a stage in the development of history as a genuine science. The possibility of a scientific treatment of history means a wider experience, a great maturity of practical reason, and finally, a fuller realization of certain basic ideas regarding the nature of life and time. These ideas are in the main two, and both form the foundation of Quranic teaching. Number 1, the unity of human origin, and we have created you all from one breath of life, says the Quran. But the perception of life as an organic unity is a slow achievement and depends for its growth on people's entry into the main current of world events. This opportunity was brought to Islam by the rapid development of a vast empire. No doubt, Christianity, long before Islam, brought the message of equality to mankind. But Christian Rome did not rise to the full apprehension of the idea of humanity as a single organism. As Flint rightly says, no Christian writer, and still less, of course, any other in the Roman Empire, can be credited with having had more than a general and abstract conception of human unity. And since the days of Rome, the idea does not seem to have gained much in depth and rootage in Europe. On the other hand, the growth of territorial nationalism, with its emphasis on what is called national characteristics, has tended rather to kill the broad human element in the art and literature of Europe. It was quite otherwise with Islam. Here, the idea was neither a concept of philosophy nor a dream of poetry. As a social movement, the aim of Islam was to make the idea a living factor in Muslims' daily life, and thus, silently and imperceptibly, to carry it towards fuller fruition. Number 2. A keen sense of reality of time and the concept of life as a continuous movement in time. It is this conception of life and time which is the main point of interest in Ibn Khaldun's view of history, and which justifies Flint's eulogy to that Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine were not his peers, and all others were unworthy of being even mentioned along with him. From the remarks that I have made above, I do not mean to throw doubt on the originality of Ibn Khaldun. All that I mean to say is that, considering the direction in which the culture of Islam has unfolded itself, only a Muslim could have viewed history as a continuous collective movement, a real, inevitable development in time. The point of interest in this view of history is the way in which Ibn Khaldun conceives the process of change. His conception is of infinite importance because of the implication that history, as a continuous movement in time, is a genuinely creative movement and not a movement whose path is already determined. Ibn Khaldun was not a metaphysician. Indeed, he was hostile to metaphysics, but in view of the nature of his conception of time, he may fairly be regarded as a forerunner of Bergson. I have already discussed the intellectual antecedents of this conception in the cultural history of Islam. The Quranic view of the alternation of the day and night as a symbol of ultimate reality which appears in a fresh glory every moment. The tendency in Muslim metaphysics to regard time as objective. Ibn Maskawiya's view of life as an evolutionary movement. And lastly, Biruni's definite approach to the conception of nature as the process of becoming. All this constituted the intellectual inheritance of Ibn Khaldun. His chief merit lies in his acute perception of and systematic expression to the spirit of the cultural movement of which he was a most brilliant product. In the work of this genius, the anti-classical spirit of Quran scores its final victory over Greek thought, for which the Greeks' time was either unreal, as in Plato and Zeno, or moved in a circle, as in Clitus and the Stoics. Whatever may be the criterion by which to judge the forward steps of a creative movement, the movement itself, if conceived as cyclic, ceases to be creative. Eternal recurrence is not eternal creation. It is eternal repetition. We are now in a position to see the true significance of the intellectual revolt of Islam against Greek philosophy. The fact that this revolt originated in a purely theological interest shows that the anti-classical spirit of the Quran asserted itself in spite of those who began with the desire to interpret Islam in the light of Greek thought. It now remains to eradicate a grave misunderstanding created by Spengler's widely read book, The Decline of the West. His two chapters devoted to the problem of Arabian culture constitute a most important contribution to the cultural history of Asia. They are, however, based on a complete misconception of the nature of Islam as a religious movement and of the cultural activity it initiated. Spengler's main thesis is that each culture is a specific organism, having no point of contact with the cultures that historically precede or follow it. Indeed, according to him, each culture has its own peculiar way of looking at things, which is entirely inaccessible to men belonging to a different culture. In his anxiety to prove this thesis, he marshals an overwhelming array of facts and interpretations to show that the spirit of European culture is through and through anti-classical. And this anti-classical spirit of European culture is entirely due to the specific genius of Europe, and not to any inspiration she may have received from the culture of Islam, which, according to Spengler's, is thoroughly Magian in spirit and character. Spengler's view of the spirit of modern culture is, in my opinion, perfectly correct. I have, however, tried to show in these lectures that the anti-classical spirit of the modern world has really arisen out of the revolt of Islam against Greek thought. It is obvious that such a view cannot be acceptable to Spengler. For if it is possible to show that the anti-classical spirit of modern culture is due to the inspiration which it received from the cultural immediately preceding it, the whole argument of Spengler regarding the complete mutual independence of cultural growths would collapse. I am afraid Spengler's anxiety to establish this thesis has completely perverted his vision of Islam as a cultural movement. By the expression Magian culture, Spengler means the common culture associated with what he calls Magian group of religions, that is, Judaism, ancient Chaldean religion, early Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam. That a Magian crust has grown over Islam, I do not deny. Indeed, my main purpose in these lectures has been to secure a vision of the spirit of Islam as emancipated from its Magian overlayings, which, in my opinion, have misled Spengler. His ignorance of Muslim thought on the problem of time as well as of the way in which the I, as a free center of experience, has found expression in the religious experience of Islam is simply appalling. Instead of seeking light from the history of Muslim thought and experience, he prefers to base his judgment on vulgar beliefs as the beginnings and end of time. Just imagine a man of overwhelming learning finding support for the supposed fatalism of Islam in such Eastern expressions and proverbs as the vault of time and everything has time. However, on the origin and growth of the concept of time in Islam and on the human ego as a free power, I have said enough in these lectures. It is obvious that a full examination of Spengler's view of Islam and of the culture that grew out of it will require a whole volume. In addition to what I have said before, I shall offer here one mere observation of a general nature. The kernel of the prophetic teaching, says Spengler, is already Magian. There is one God, be he called Yahweh, Mazda, or Madruk Baal, who is the principle of good, and all other deities are either impotent or evil. To this doctrine, there attached itself the hope of a Messiah, very clear in Isaiah, but also bursting out of everything and everywhere during the next centuries, under pressure of an inner necessity. It is the basic idea of Magian religion, for it contains implicitly the conception of the world historical struggle between good and evil, with the power of evil prevailing in the middle period and the good finally triumphant on the day of judgment. If this view of the prophetic teaching is meant to apply to Islam, it is obviously a misrepresentation. The point to note is that the Magian admitted the existence of false gods, only they did not turn to worship them. Islam denies the very existence of false gods. In this connection, Spengler fails to appreciate the cultural value of the idea of finality of prophethood in Islam. No doubt, one important feature of Magian culture is a perpetual attitude of expectation, a constant looking forward to the coming of Zoroaster's unborn sons, the Messiah, or the feet of the fourth gospel. I have already indicated the direction in which the student of Islam should seek the cultural meaning of the doctrine of finality in Islam. It may further be regarded as a psychological cure for the Magian attitude of constant expectation, which tends to give a false view of history. Ibn Khaldun, seeing the spirit of his own view of history, has fully criticized and, I believe, finally demolished the alleged revelational basis in Islam of an idea similar, at least in its psychological effects, to the original Magian idea, which had reappeared in Islam under the pressure of Magian thought.